Welcome, everybody. We're so glad you could come today for this very fun and interesting program about Greenland, which is beautiful and very topical as well in the news. And we have here today Barry Pell, who's a world traveler and a photojournalist who will share his experiences in Greenland. And please join me in a warm welcome for Barry Pell.
Thank you, Sarah. It is great to be here again, and today we are taking another voyage to an exotic part of the world, a part of the world that's certainly been topical, as Sarah suggested, in the news of late, although not in recent weeks, thank goodness, but certainly it has been widely talked about. And this program, though, is not going to be political in any way. I will steer clear of politics. We don't want to have any dissension break out in the audience, but I do hope that in telling you something about Greenland, that I will leave you with a better understanding, together with my photography, of this, which is in fact the world's largest island, and also tell you something about its history, the culture, the people, and especially the magnificent ice sheet, the glaciers, the icebergs that cover some 4/5 of the land area of the island. So Greenland, if you look at your map, Greenland is located in the North Atlantic Ocean, northeast of Canada. So it is very close, actually, to the nearest point of land on Canada, only about 20 miles. So geographically, it's considered a part of North America. But indeed, as you'll see from this program, in terms of its history and its culture, it shares much more in common with Europe than it does with North America. And consequently, its population, which today is about 56,000, is a very fascinating mix of Scandinavian people, predominantly Danish, as well as the indigenous Inuit people who came over thousands of years ago, crossing from Siberia originally. Now, you all know, because of the news, again, that Greenland is not a country, but it has been a colony of Denmark since the 1700s. And its continued ownership by Denmark is controversial, has been controversial for some time. Many people in Denmark would like to jettison this land. Others, some people in Greenland, feel that it's time that they had their independence. And I'll speak about that as well. So the Arctic Circle divides the island. Most of Greenland is north of the circle. And what that means is that for a large part of the winter months, there is complete darkness, 24 hours of darkness. In the summer months, it's quite the opposite, with 24 hours of daylight. It's therefore the land of the midnight sun. And of course, the long nights of winter has created many problems, notably alcoholism, suicide. As a traveler, of course, I picked the summer season, and when it was a whole lot easier to take some photography as well and to travel around. So I've had to continually update this program because of the climate change that is ongoing here. And the increasing warming of the Earth's atmosphere, the seas, has certainly severely had a lot of local severe impact on Greenland. The scientific measurements are continually being done on the island, and by any measure, they are mind-boggling to comprehend. In recent summer seasons, there have been extreme ice melt events which have resulted in Greenland losing as much as 250 billion tons of ice, which is an amount equal to the world's population of fresh water, the entire world, for a period of 40 years, which is an amazing statistic. Aside from global impacts, though, the warming of Greenland has had a lot of negative local impacts. It's affected the Inuit way of life. The ice which they depend on to go out and hunt on freezes up later and later. It thaws earlier. Many Inuit have had to give up their lifestyle of living on the ice and benefiting their family for food by living that type of traditional lifestyle. They've had to move into cities and towns where they're frankly very ill prepared for the kinds of different challenges in existing in those places. They're simply not as prepared for. And just as small events, the warming of the atmosphere has brought infestations of bugs further north, which never lived that far in the north of Greenland, and also has upset the migration patterns of animals and has created an endangerment for many plant species as well. So it's had not only these global impacts, but a lot of very localized impacts. Again, on the map, you see Greenland on the bottom. The capital is in two languages. In the Danish language, it's Gottorp, on the southwest, where the star is. In the Greenlandic language, it's Nuuk. And one of the places you may be familiar with, Thule Air Force Base, run by the Americans, is up in the northwest. You can also, I think, perhaps, maybe on this map, the Arctic Circle runs through here. I guess it's not shown on here, but it's about a third of the way up up from the southern tip of Greenland. So most of the island is north of the Arctic Circle. And then to the southeast, which is relevant here, you'll see Iceland showing its capital, Reykjavik. So it's only about 150 or so miles from Iceland up to Greenland. Okay, so let me begin. The name Greenland itself, certainly as somebody reminded me before we started today, Greenland is icy, Iceland is green, as we learned in primary school. But the name Greenland may be the world's, therefore, greatest misnomer, and also, I would suggest, the biggest real estate scam ever perpetrated. And that is because near the end of the 10th century, there was a man, Norwegian man, he was living on the island of Iceland, not too far away, and he committed a murder. His name was Eric the Red, because he had a red beard and red hair, and his punishment, which was a fairly typical punishment for a crime of that nature, was to be exiled, to be banished from his homeland for a period of time. And his sentence was 3 years. And so he had 3 years on his hands, and he decided to go out to sea on his Viking, he was a Viking, on his Viking longship, and to explore. Well, he had heard that there was an island up to the northwest, some large island, and so he started exploring. And he eventually reached a part of the west coast of what became Greenland that seemed ice-free, and it actually seemed a place that appealed to him. And it's a place that he thought, well, he could start a settlement here. He could actually draw people to start a colony here. Of course, he needed colonizers. He needed people. And so he went back when his sentence was up to Iceland, and he started a Madison Avenue style promotion for this new island that he had found in order to encourage settlers to join him. And eventually that amounted to about 5,000 people who he convinced to come to this new island. And of course, he had to have a good sales pitch, and so he called it Greenland. He invented it. He made it up. His theory, of course, which makes a lot of sense, is that people would be attracted to go there if it had a favorable name. Seems like common sense. And his salesmanship, as I say, proved very successful. He returned in the year 985 with, as I said, quite a large number of colonists who were convinced that this fertile, supposedly green land held great opportunity. And this became then medieval Europe's furthest frontier. And so these people who came with Eric, these were Norse people. We also refer to them as Vikings. That is, the Norse people are from Scandinavia, but originally they had Germanic ancestry. And Viking refers to these Norse people specifically who were seafaring. So it's a sort of subset of the Norse Scandinavians. These were people who went out to sea on their long ships to discover and plunder and trade. these are some of the negative things we think about Vikings, but they also settled and brought their culture. They explored, they opened up new lands, and so they were responsible for some very positive things in a lot of the areas of the North Sea, everywhere from England to the north coast of Europe. This is a mock-up of a Viking in his longship. Here's a Viking longship that was unearthed in the mud off the coast of Norway and reconstructed. I visited this when I was in Norway. But the word Viking, interestingly, those interested in the etymology of words, the word Viking actually derives as not a noun, but a verb. So people would speak about going Viking. So if a Norse person wanted to go out to sea and start exploring and plundering and whatever, looking for riches, they would be said to go Viking. And that's the form that the word took. Now, Eric the Red then is credited as the first permanent European settler of Greenland, but he was the father of that other very famous Viking we learned about in school, who was Leif Erikson. And Leif Erikson, of course, was the first European explorer of North America, way before, 500 years before Columbus arrived here in present-day Newfoundland, Canada. So, with Eric the Red's sales pitch, the name Greenland stuck. We know it as Greenland today. Of course, the place wasn't vacant when he arrived. In fact, there were many native people living there, and they would have been quite surprised to know that this foreigner had showed up and decided to call their island Greenland. In their language, the name is called Kalalit Nunat, which means the land of these people, the Kalalit people. And Kalalit, by the way, simply Inuit simply translates to mean the people. We used to call a lot of these people when I was back in school, we used to refer to them as Eskimo, but that term has appropriately fallen quite out of favor these days. In place, they are called Inuit. Partly it's because of the pejorative nature of the word Eskimo, which translates to mean the eater of raw flesh. And who wants to be known as the eater of raw flesh? So Greenland, then, is indeed the world's largest island. It is slightly more than 3 times the size of Texas, and it is permanently covered with an ice sheet that extends, as you see here in white, extends over 4/5 of its land area. And the only other ice sheet on our planet, of course, covers some 99% of Antarctica. Now, because of the location of that ice sheet, you can't establish towns or villages or population centers on the ice sheets. And so instead, the population is concentrated along the ice-free coasts. And those are shown here a little bit up in the north, but mostly along the southwest, somewhat along the southeast as well, as you see here in these different colors. And that is where the island's 56,000 people are located. So although it's one of the least dense lands in the world, it actually, the population is concentrated in the villages and towns in those ice-free areas, the 20% of the island. And so it presents as kind of a dense place, even though overall, it is very, very low density. The capital and largest city, in the Greenlandic language, it's called Nuuk, N-U-U-K. In the Danish language, it is called Good Hope, or Gotab, and it has about 30% of the island's population. So you have all of this ice, and the ice works its way down from the center. It pushes out toward the coast, and over time, it has carved its way to the coast, especially after the last ice age, and formed these channels, these indentations along the perimeter of the island, which we know as fjords. So the fjords are these very deep chasms, these canyons, that were formed when the ice at the last ice age, retreated to the surrounding ocean and then scoured out these openings. And when the ice melted, then the seawater from the surrounding ocean filled it in. So they're not rivers, they're kind of estuaries of salt water, seawater, that came in, and they went as far as where the existing glaciers are today. Now, because of that, the width of these fjords is quite large. It could be upwards of a half mile or a mile wide. And so it's pretty well impossible to travel across these fjords by any kind of road. So there are really, except for some pavement that's within the villages themselves, there are no roads, highways of any sort, as we know them, in the entire island. Instead, transportation depends on two forms of access. The principal one is by the water, of course, because there is so much water. And you could see an illustration here of the effect, the extent of these fjords. So you have one of these fjords every several miles. You have villages that have been established on the green and yellow areas, but getting from one to the next, if you want to travel along the coast, is impossible to build any kind of roadway network that would connect all of this area. And so transportation is, number one, by the sea, and it also is, of course, by air. Now, on the sea, there are three kinds of transportation that are used. The government runs a weekly ferry that plies up and down the coast of, west coast of Greenland. It's a large ship that you see here. And the ship also provides connection to Europe, the mainland of Europe. And many of the people who live on the island, especially some of the Inuit, during the season when they are not hunting, they need work. And many of them go off island to Denmark and other cities, and other places in Europe to find jobs. And so they need to leave their families. And they're often away from their families for months or upwards of a half year at a time. And so when the ferry comes into port once a week, it is quite a dramatic scene. It's one of the best ways I found to get a sense of the Greenlandic or Inuit people, because there are many, on the one hand, it's a very wide range of emotion. There are, on the one hand, many happy reunions of fathers and husbands returning from having been away for 3, 4, 5 months. And then, of course, there are also lots of teary goodbyes for some of the family members who are about to leave their family. It's a very family-oriented place, which I learned, and you'll see a little later in this program. So a lot of emotional exchange that happens at the dock if you go down to the large ferry dock. The second use of the water is for fishing, because fishing and fur trapping is the two primary activities. Fishing by far is the largest income earner, and so you will see a lot of these medium-sized fishing boats plying the waters around the island. And then thirdly, of course, there has been a tremendous growth in tourism. And so you have a lot of vessels like these who ply the waters and will take visitors up as close as safely as possible to get to the edge of some of the glaciers and icebergs to get some pretty amazing photos. So we have, again, helping local people, transportation, fishing, and we have tourism. Now, and this is part of their fishing fleet. And the other form of transportation is by air. Now, because of the fact that a lot of the ground area is soft tundra, it gets very spongy when the summer season comes. And also, there aren't a lot of areas where there is enough room for an extensive runway. And so, because of both of those conditions, most of the air transportation is by helicopter. And Greenland maintains a fleet of several dozen helicopters to get access to around the island, especially to some of the more remote parts in the north. They also use these for medical evacuations. There is one airport at the town, the capital, Newark, and they have built a supported runway. It has to be very specially built to handle the loads of these planes. But before I speak about what Greenland is like today, I'd like to return and give you a little background on some history. Well, before Eric the Red's arrival, Greenland was home to a succession of an evolution of different Inuit people. There were, first of all, some pre-Inuit called Paleo-Eskimo cultures, and originally these people arrived by going from Siberia. They, over many thousands of years, they crossed the Bering Strait that separates Siberia from North America. They crossed across what is today Canada. And then, again, because there's only 20 miles separating Canada from Greenland, they then were able to cross over to Greenland. And that happened about 2500 BCE. And all of these people were nomadic hunters. They hunted for whale, they hunted for seal in these canoes. Now, the Dorset culture, one of these later cultures, was able to establish settlements on the island's coastal areas. And again, mostly they live by whale hunting. And here are some whale bones that have been erected as a ceremonial entrance to a village today. The Dorset people were succeeded by an Inuit culture called the Thules. And the Thules are the ancestors of the current Greenlandic population. That happened about 1300 AD. Now, the Thule culture was responsible for a lot of innovations, a lot of modern innovations, which have actually come down to their people and have been used around the world. Among them, they started using sleds. This was a technological innovation at the time it was introduced, and these were used, dogs were used to pull these sleds over the ice for their hunting and transportation needs. The Thules also introduced two pointed harpoons so that when they were out spearing whales, one of the points of the harpoon would first spear the whale, and then the second one would make sure that that spear could not be pulled out by the animal as it raced along. And in addition, the Thules invented kayaks. Kayak is, in fact, an Inuit word, which has come down to us in the English language. Kayaks were used for carrying one or two people in their narrow shell, or there are wider ones called umiaks, capable of transporting more people and their possessions. So when the Norse people arrived, Eric the Red and his contingent arrived in the 10th century, there weren't all that many of them. There weren't all that many. The island was big enough to accommodate both the Inuit people and the Norse people. And at first, they got along quite well together. The Thule taught them how to survive in this challenging environment. But we know very, very little about what that coexistence entailed. There have been found by archaeologists some runic stone inscriptions. Runics are sort of symbols that was an ancient language of Europe. And there have been found, like these, some ruins of stone house foundations. But there was certainly no written record that could tell us the history of these early settlements. And so what we do know today about early life in Greenland comes to us from something called the Norse sagas. And these were stories that were written down. They were anonymous stories that told about genealogy of the Norse and the struggles and conflicts from these early societies. But they weren't written for 300 years after the first Europeans arrived. And so a lot of them clearly are hearsay. But they do provide, again, the only evidence to talk about what existed there. They tell of the establishment of dairy and sheep farms and the construction of stone and side-roofed houses. And based on that evidence in the sagas, archaeologists have come in and have unearthed, have dug out, and discovered some of the foundations that are referenced in the sagas, and in some cases they've been able to rebuild some of those buildings to give an idea of what life was like at that time, churches, for example. And so anything that you see that is a fair height above ground, like this church door, is a reconstruction, of course. And it's a reconstruction, though, based on what was written down in those Norse sagas. Now, when Eric and his supporters first arrived in Greenland, they were pagan worshippers. They worshipped a variety of Norse gods, but Eric's wife converted to Christianity. And then Eric convinced the rest of the estimated 5,000 population to eventually accept it. And so, based on what was written in the sagas, this is the reconstructed entrance to a small side-wall chapel that was uncovered in 1961 that Eric had built, according to the sagas, had built for his wife. Now, today, the major religion is Protestant Christianity, mostly members of the Lutheran Church of Denmark. And some of these churches are quite stunning, particularly the interiors. And very often, in the interiors of these churches, you will find hanging replicas of ships, which are dedicated, of course, to sailing. The sailors, many of whom perished in the seas around the island. And of course, the surrounding churchyards are evidence of, with their graves and grave markers, of many who were lost at sea in these challenging waters. Now, more than the sagas, what is historically verifiable in the natural environment of Greenland is that scientists have dug very deeply ice cores in the ice, which demonstrate that over the past 100,000 years, there have been a lot of oscillations in the climate and temperature. And in fact, during the 14th and 15th centuries, there was what biologists call a little ice age. And during that time, temperatures dropped substantially. And this climate was very adverse for the settlers who were there. And in fact, by that time, they had been there about 400 years or so, many of the settlers had chopped down what little available wood there was from the forest to build some of their homes. And so essentially they were destroying their environment. So we had the very cold weather, the destruction of the environment that they were manifesting, and also there got to be more and more conflict with the Inuit people who were there. And all of those three factors conspired to convince the Norse settlers, those original descendants of Eric the Red, that it was time to pack up and leave. And to a person, they took all of their possessions and they went back to Scandinavia, leaving virtually no trace of their presence for that 500-year period since Eric the Red had arrived there in the 900s. Now, the last written records of the presence of the Norse Greenlanders are of a wedding that occurred in the year 1408 in a church in a small village called Wellesley. And today, the ruins of this church are quite dramatic. They sit wedged adjacent to a fjord and a rocky hillside. And indeed, this is the best preserved building from that original Norse settlement for one simple reason. It was very well built. A lot of the houses and public structures were built from sod or wood, which of course deteriorated. But this structure, as you see, was built from stone. Not only simple stone, but the walls were 5 feet thick. And so this structure remained over the centuries and is, as I say, the best example of the presence of the Norse during their first time there. In fact, Wellesley Church was inscribed on the United Nations UNESCO World Heritage List in the year 2017. So, of course, after the Norse settlements died out, they all left. The Inuit people, you can imagine, were pretty overjoyed. They had their island back. But the Danish government, somehow, they never forgot or even relinquished their claims to Greenland that they had, in fact, inherited originally from the Norwegians, because ownership in Scandinavia went back and forth between Norway and Denmark for centuries. And so imagine this is some more pictures of Wellesley Church. Imagine that the Norwegians, who were in Iceland, the Norwegians settled this place. They stuck around for 400 or 500 years. Then they left. They left entirely. But then after 300 more years, they woke up and they said, we used to own Greenland. I think we still do. A lot of presumption there. And so they sent their forces back to Greenland to claim it for Denmark. It's an amazing amount of bravado that, and that's exactly what they did. And they asserted their sovereignty over the island and all the people living there. So, of course, records of this later period of Danish settlement are much more readily available. In fact, some of the homes from that early colonial period still exist, for this one from the 18th century. So, although Greenland is self-governing and largely autonomous, it is not an independent country. It remains part of Denmark. Their flag is shown here, which expresses this mixed allegiance. The red and white, red is the color of the Danish flag, but the flag is uniquely Greenlandic. The red and white are the shapes of the flag convey the two most important natural elements that affect the island. Of course, the white represents the ice and snow that covers most of the island, and the red is symbolic of the sun. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, the continued semi-independent status of Greenland is quite controversial, because many native Greenlanders, they'd rather not be associated with Denmark anymore. They feel that the Danish government collects heavy taxes from them, but doesn't give them any commensurate investment or provision of social services. And on the other hand, many Danes feel that that Greenland as a colony is a drain on their resources, that frankly it doesn't provide anything to the benefit of the country of Denmark, and they'd rather jettison this place entirely. So there's a lot of controversy about that. Of course, the reality is that the harsh climate, the limited resources of Greenland would make their being an independent country nearly impossible to survive. Their industries are only, as I say, fishing, shrimping, and some like the fishing fleet shown here. Some of these, the fishing goes on up during the winter time, including some of these very alien-looking spotted fish. And then, of course, the other industry that's big is the working of furs, fur trapping animals, and now tourism is growing. And then there's a potential industry in rare earth metals, which I'll speak about a bit later. But in fact, it would be very difficult for Greenland to be jettisoned and to be an independent country. And so Denmark is aware of that. And frankly, they're not likely to abandon Greenland, and they continue to subsidize the island as a responsibility of their historic ties. Now, very interestingly, to kind of indicate that there's nothing new under the sun, in 1946, the United States, it was kind of a strategic move at the start of the Cold War, the United States offered to buy Greenland from Denmark. They offered Denmark $100 million for this purchase, and Denmark turned us down. Now, also an interesting chapter of Greenland's recent history occurred during and after World War II, because Greenland became very, very strategic for the supply of troops and equipment, military equipment, as a base to the European war front. And there was a lot of cooperation between the United States and the island of Greenland with Denmark. And soon after the United States entered the war, it built an airfield, which still exists, shown here near a town called Narsarsuaq, near the southern tip of the island. Now, to build this airstrip, because the land is so spongy and unstable, they actually had to invent a new type of mesh metal runway material in order to enable their heavy B-25 bombers to land and take off on this runway. And of course, they needed a long runway, and there wasn't a lot of room for a long runway, and so it was built where one end was right at the edge of a fjord, and the other end was at a vertical mountain. And so landings and takeoffs had to be quite pinpoint perfect. And in order to keep this place secret from the Germans, there was no control tower either. So they were, and as you know, the weather isn't always very accommodating. So this was quite harrowing for a lot of access. But the base was, in fact, instrumental in the war effort. At its peak, it housed some 4,000 American servicemen and women. And it's estimated that some 100 aircraft some 10,000 aircraft landed there en route to the war in Europe and North Africa. And so today the entire base at Narsarsuaq has been decommissioned, but they've left everything there. It's set up as a museum. The communications equipment, the office furniture, even posters about upcoming social dances have been kept on the walls. And as I walk through this museum, which was operated during a very pre-computer age, it certainly felt like I had entered a time capsule. Now, in the early 1950s, as part of a NATO Cold War strategy, the United States established an air base in the very remote north of Greenland in a place called Thule. This place was previously known as Thule Air Force Base. It was renamed Pituffik Space Base in 2023. Pituffik translates to have an unusual meaning. It actually means the place the dogs are tied. Not sure how that's relevant here, but that's the name. And in fact, in order to construct this top secret base, the population of 3 villages of Inuit had to be relocated some 65 miles away. And a bit of an embarrassment occurred there during the operation of this base during the Cold War, and that is that Denmark at that time, still today I think, has a non-nuclear proliferation policy. And so when the United States went to say, well, we need some nuclear weapons to be placed here and to be put on some of our bombers just in case, Denmark turned to them and said, no way, we do not use nuclear weapons. So, of course, the United States went ahead and did it anyway, but they did it secretly. And it was discovered many decades later, in 1997, when the Danes were looking for records related to the crash of a nuclear-equipped B-52 bomber, and they were not very happy. Well, Greenland is bordered by the Arctic and Atlantic Oceans. It is, as I mentioned, just northeast of Canada. Geographically, it is considered part of the continent of North America, since it's only 20 miles from the nearest point of land in Canada. But politically and culturally, it's been associated with Europe for, well, as you see, more than a millennium. And the bulk of its area is north of the Arctic Circle. So for nearly all of Greenland, the sun never sets for a part of the summer. And the length of that midnight sun depends on the distance north you are of the circle. For example, about halfway north in Greenland, the sun does not set from the end of May until the end of July. Never sets. And during that period, the sun will arc slowly toward the horizon, but never drops below it. And as you can imagine, that creates some very dreamy-looking scenery with icebergs and hilltops bathed in a filmy palette of a kaleidoscope of pinks and purples, yellows, and red hues. Of course, the winters are correspondingly dark, and so what they've done to counter some of that depressing darkness is they have historically painted the exteriors of their homes bright, shiny colors. And so when you look at these places, they give that appearance, sort of stands out from the darkness in the winters. Now, the other thing that they used to do, and I'm not sure if they still do, is historically there was a law that required the owner of a house to paint the house a color that corresponded to their profession. So, it's an interesting concept. So, if you were wandering around in the dark, weren't quite sure where you were, but were in need of a doctor, you would simply go to the yellow house because doctors had to paint their houses yellow. Seems like a great idea, actually. So the culture of Greenland then has been largely influenced by its Inuit traditions, since nearly 90% of the population is descended from those indigenous people. And many people still go ice fishing. There are annual dog sled races. A lot of the Inuit culture holds sway. Most Greenlanders still hunt, at least part-time, to supplement their diet and provide skins for their clothing and for their sides of their kayaks. And here, some fur pelts are displayed to be handcrafted into warm and luxurious outerwear. So the Greenlandic people, the Inuit people, have, particularly those in the north of the island, have survived for millennia. They hunted whale, as I mentioned, polar bear, and seal. And hunting is still today a very vital part of their everyday life and culture. It's an important part of their food security. And it provides nutritious food. It provides income to their families when they sell some of it. The Inuit, in this day and age of everything being politically correct against hunting, in part, the Inuit people are very defensive about bad publicity for their traditional lifestyle. Unlike other northern people or nations like Japan, who have been shown to club baby seals to death, does not add to their image, Greenlanders kill only what they need to survive and use humane methods. They use every part of the animal for their survival. The thought of doing things in an inhumane method is abhorrent to them. Here is a seal sculpture in Greenland's capital. But as valued as it is, as important as it is for the survival of the Inuit, Greenland is under tremendous political and environmental pressure from groups which have led Greenland's government to set quotas, limits on what can be hunted by the Inuit for most species. And many Greenlanders say it's hard for them to survive based on the quotas that have been established. And for the Inuit, animal rights campaigns are just the latest in a long litany of religious, industrial, and government policies imposed by outsiders. It's a part of why they want to be independent, so they won't fall under European Union rules. The policies, they feel, ignore Inuit values, ignore the realities, and threaten their survival, which they are one of the last remaining Aboriginal hunting cultures. Now, many people, especially in the north of the island, they hunt using these long sleds that they have a long time ago invented. The sleds are pulled by packs of dogs. And these animals are similar to huskies, but they are actually a separate breed. They're known as the Greenland dog. They've been inbred with some wolf-like behaviors. They are thought to have been brought to Greenland by the first Inuit settlers, and they are never allowed to be taken out of northern Greenland. If they are, they can never be returned. No other breeds can be brought in. They very much want to preserve the purity of this important breed. And the animals are raised for the sole purpose as being working dogs for the benefit of the Inuit during the winter to pull these sleds. So, as they explained to me, very soberly, they are not pets. They were never pets, they will never be pets. And so and they can't afford, frankly, to keep them as pets, to feed them. And so after their working life is finished, which is at about 6 or 7 years of age, the owners shoot them. And this seemed rather dramatic to me. Everything else about the Greenland people seemed extremely decent and loving and caring, but this was a fact of life for what was necessary in northern Greenland. And during the summer months, of course, they have nothing to do before the ice freezes up. And so they're typically chained, frequently can be heard making wolf-like screams as they restlessly await the freedom of the ice. So gender roles among the Inuit are quite flexible. Traditionally, though, it is the men who hunt and the women who then prepare the meat and the skins. Marriages are mostly by choice as opposed to being arranged. And extended families, as I learned, are extremely important, which is why if some people do go off island to work for a time, they will invariably come back to be with their families. We observe that on many occasions, for example, at this wedding gathering. There also has been a lot of intermarriage, which is not scorned, between the Inuit over generations and the Europeans who have come in. And you can typically know how much that mixing is reflected in their appearance. So, for example, this man looks very much like an original Inuit person with very little mixed blood, but many of the Inuit today appear more similar to Northern Europeans with quite a bit of mixing of European and Inuit genes. Now, in previous times, the Inuits depended on local materials, what was available. They made their clothing from animal hides, from skins. Men's clothing was made so that the men would neither freeze to death on their long hunting trips in the winter ice, nor be soaked to the skin when hunting by kayak. The Inuits had a saying, I think you'll like this. They said, "A man is what his wife makes him," because they knew that if they were to survive in the harsh Arctic winter, the skins used in their clothing had to be carefully chosen and perfectly sewn. And so being a skilled seamstress earned a woman a great deal of respect in Inuit society. If she could sew good reindeer or sealskin boots, shown here, called kamiks, and waterproof jackets called anoraks, then the family was assured a good existence. And then the Europeans arrived in Greenland, and they started to bring with them more artificial materials. They had silk fabrics that they brought in. They had beads that they came to trade with. And eventually, these goods became incorporated into the dress of the Inuit, particularly for festive attire like holidays and weddings. For men, the hide trousers of animal hides were replaced with a thick woolen material called hommenskald, literally translates as island cloth. For women, their anoraks were then sewn in silks. European beads, the Inuit originally for their buttons, they used bone. And eventually European beads were introduced, which took their place. And gradually it became more prestigious to use these European products. And this trend is particularly visible today on the women's national costume shown here. Well, you mentioned something about the language of Greenland, which is also something that separates them from their colonizer Denmark. It's called Greenlandic, not surprisingly. It was brought to the island by the Thule culture in the 1200s. It's closely related to many of the Inuit languages around the Arctic Circle around the world, from Canada to Siberia. Now, when Denmark colonized Greenland in the 1700s, of course, they said, no more of this Greenlandic language. Everybody has to speak Danish. They were very racist about the whole situation. And the education system, all official functions, business, had to be constructed in Danish. And that lasted all the way up until Greenland was given home rule in 1979. And so today, uniquely, Greenlandic is the sole official language. Danish is not. And it is a unique example of an indigenous language in the Americas that serves exclusively as the official language of a country that is not independent. Now, Greenlandic, as you see, uses very long words. Here's just one example, law firm shown in Danish on the top, and the much longer word in the middle is Greenlandic. They use lots of Q's, U's, and A's in their words. I'm sure they have some amazing Scrabble games. And they also have here's another street name sign. The island has a 100% literacy rate. Many Greenlanders go to Denmark for higher education. So, A little about the natural environment. With all this ice and snow cover, one might think that it is a very cold place where little, if anything, can grow. And indeed, they do have a very short growing season. The winters can be brutal. But during the short summers, when the coastal inhabited areas are ice-free, daytime temperatures rise into the 50s and, in fact, have been getting warmer. Many parts of the island south average some 300 days of sunshine a year. The land supports a variety of plant species, and landscapes erupt in a great deal of beauty. Colors of all types, from their flowers, they have wispy cotton grass, shown here, as well as many different species of herbs and carpets of mosses and heather. It's quite a beautiful time. The national flower of Greenland is called the Niviarsiak, which means young maidens. Now, of course, like many northern countries, if any of you have gone summer camping, say in Canada, you know that during the mild weather come out millions of mosquitoes. And so if you do go out in the thaw of summer in Greenland for any kind of a hike, it becomes obligatory to wear a head net. Otherwise, you'll get eaten alive. So I think you'll agree the history of exploration, the arrival of the Norse people, the Vikings, the culture of the Inuits is quite fascinating. But frankly, most people who come to Greenland don't really give much interest to any of this stuff. What they're there to do is to see the otherworldly environment of the ice sheet that covers 80% of the land, the glaciers, and particularly the fantastically shaped icebergs. And viewing this landscape is accomplished, as I mentioned before, by boat, by helicopter, and also by hiking. And there are many, many hiking paths. Of course, maintaining these paths is not always easy because the tundra results in frequent undulations and destruction of some of the wooden boardwalks that access the front edge of these icebergs. All three of these ways of viewing, though, and I did find going by air was a particularly spectacular way to get close above these icebergs, provides some amazing views, breathtaking views of these sculptural giants floating out placidly in the sea. And of course, once they do cave off or break off from the leading edge of a glacier, they then immediately begin to be sculpted in these fantastical shapes by the sun, by the wind, and by the water erosion. And these are just a couple of photos of that. Now also, you may know that the blue color of icebergs is due to the fact that the ice in the berg from the glacier is very, very high density because of every year falling snow, which compresses and essentially squeezes out any of the air from the center of the berg, most of the air. And the reason that the color that you see is blue is that in the spectrum of light, there are long wavelengths and short wavelengths, and the long wavelengths are things like oranges and reds, but they're too long to get through the density of the ice. So the only wavelengths that can escape are the short wavelengths of greens and blues at the other end of the spectrum. And so those are the ones that escape and come to our eyes. Now, as the icebergs melt, because they have all this compressed air in them, and they may have been that way for thousands of years, as the icebergs melt, you can hear then a constant fizzing and popping sounds as the condensed air is released, sort of like opening a bottle of effervescent water. Also, you probably know that when you see an iceberg very beautifully, placidly floating above the waterline, fully 80% of the ice is actually below the waterline, cannot be seen, and can be quite spread out. And that, of course, is what got the Titanic in big trouble, because the captain was not aware that this iceberg extended so far under the water. And so when we would go out in our tourist ship to get close and personal with some of these icebergs, I was always a little bit nervous about looking out my cabin window to see how close we were getting, wondering what kind of ice lurked immediately under the ship itself. Of course, if you do get nervous, and some people did, thinking about the Titanic adventure, then the captain will scoop up some 1,000-year-old ice that's broken up from the water, and he'll immediately mix you a stiff drink. And that certainly helped allay any of the anxiety that we had. So the Greenland ice sheet is also known as the inland ice. The ice sheet itself that covers this island is a staggering 1,500 miles long. It's 700 miles wide at its widest point, and it's generally about 1 mile thick. That's why so much fresh water is released when it melts. It's 1 mile thick. In places, it is 2 miles thick. And the weight of this has actually depressed the center of Greenland to be below sea level. It's created a basin in the middle of the island about 1,000 feet below sea level. And the ice sheet itself is not static. It flows slowly to the coast from the center of the island. And as I said, it's formed by layers of compressed snow. The ice in the current ice sheet is estimated to be over 100,000 years old, and that's partly from the cores that have been drilled into the sheet to understand the timeline of past climates on Earth. So a glacier essentially is also a constant body of compressed snow moving under its own gravity. The snow collects, it's compacted by the weight of snow above it, and once the air is squeezed very densely, the snow is turned into extremely dense glacial ice. So the difference between an ice sheet and a glacier is simply size. So an ice sheet is a continental glacier, covers the entire land area. Greenland contains hundreds of glaciers. Their widths range from several hundred feet to several miles in length, and they can go back toward the horizon dozens of miles. These are truly rivers of ice carving their way across the land and abrading rock in their path, gouging out canyons constantly to create unique landforms, like this, for example, which as it travels down a mountainside will pick up rock that it embeds in itself, these so-called moraines, which then have the appearance of being a kind of highway or a roadway within the length of the glacier itself. There are inland glaciers that end before they reach the water, but most glaciers in the world and in Greenland are called outlet glaciers, which then end at a fjord of meltwater with arms that reach into the sea. And as the ice approaches the coast, the temperature rises. They're above freezing temperatures of the seawater itself, and so huge pieces break off or calve, forming these icebergs. Most tidewater glaciers calve above sea level, and as a result, because they are very, very high, some of them are 300-400 feet high, when a piece of ice breaks off, that might weigh 3 or 4 tons. You can imagine its fall into the water creates an enormous explosion, a kind of a mini tsunami as it strikes the water. Now, scientists have developed an entire vocabulary to classify the shape of icebergs, terms like pinnacle and dome, wedge, and blocky. This was of no interest to me at all. In terms of more lay vistas, to me, these icebergs were simply elegant and majestic, truly awe-inspiring creations of nature. So Greenland's ice sheet and its glaciers indeed are melting, and they are receding. Now, over history, as the ice cores have shown, there have been cycles of advancing and receding glaciers recorded for hundreds of years. But the loss of ice in recent years is at a much larger and a much faster scale than ever before. A few years ago, a piece of ice twice the size of Manhattan Island broke away from a glacier in northern Greenland. And during June of the same year, nearly 100% of the surface of the ice on the ice sheet was shown to be melting. So this is a satellite image which shows that typically on normal annual events from the past, the image on the left shows that most of the ice at the surface of Greenland, shown in white, was still quite intact, whereas in more recent years, the entire surface, taken from a satellite image, the entire surface of Greenland has been shown to be in a melting condition at the height of the summer, except for a couple of little spotty locations. But some 97, 98% of the ice was shown to be in a state of melting. There are also thousands of sinkholes in Greenland where water is draining through the ice sheet underneath the ice. You can't even see it, except if you go out to the coast, you will see this water flowing out where it is melting under the ice. This meltwater, by the way, is the largest current contributor to global sea level rise, and that rise caused by Greenland's melting has been twice as much as the rise caused by melting in Antarctica. And if the ice sheet, here's a statistic which is somewhat frightening, not likely to happen soon, but if the ice sheet covering Greenland were to melt entirely, sea levels would rise all around the world by some 24 feet. Now, I was able to observe the towering face of a glacier from the safety of a boat several hundred yards away. And about every 10 minutes, huge chunks of ice would calve off, crashing into the fjord and setting off these mini tsunamis, which our captain had to be very careful to avoid upsetting and capsizing our boat. We could not get too close. Of course, we tourists had made the 3-hour trip up the fjord in hopeful anticipation of viewing this spectacular event, of watching this gigantic piece of ice break off of a glacier and fall into the sea, but I must say it was a guilty pleasure when considering the significance of this much more rapid glacial melting. So, in terms of the Inuit, the increase in average temperatures in the Arctic has been over 6 degrees during the past 50 years, and that's caused the ice to melt faster, but it has had a dramatic effect on the wildlife, the environment, and the culture of the Inuit people. There is less sea ice on which to hunt. The hunting season is 1 to 2 months shorter than it used to be. Hunters do not have enough food for their families. Many of the animals which they hunt for survival contain worms and parasites which have migrated north with the warmer weather. And so protection and preservation of the traditional Inuit way of life is truly endangered. Many Inuits have, in fact, been forced to abandon their lifestyles. They've had to relocate to towns, and in these towns, these are completely alien to their historic lifestyle. They're ill-prepared for the pressures of urban life. They're often placed in large public housing projects, such as this one in the capital, Newark, that are alien to their lifestyle, have little social support that they've been accustomed to, and frequently become rundown and crime-ridden slums. Now, although Greenland has had home rule since 1979, Denmark still controls a number of areas, including foreign relations, defense, and currency systems, and legal systems. Throughout this time, there have been political parties, there have been individuals in Greenland fighting for a fully independent country. And their home rule agreement, in fact, allows for full independence if approved by a majority of the people. Their latest referendum was in 2017, but it showed that nearly 80% of Greenlanders opposed sovereignty if it meant a fall in living standards. And as I mentioned previously, Greenland's economy, historically limited to fishing, furs, and tourism, make it questionable whether the island could thrive or survive independently. But it's also known that Greenland contains large deposits of critical minerals, rare earth metals, graphite, platinum, titanium, nickel, copper, among others. And these elements are vital components of green technology for wind turbines, for example, electric vehicles, energy storage, national security. And accordingly, Greenland has attracted the attention of major world powers to exploit these increasingly valuable resources. Adding to this attention is the fact that the island's strategic location has become more important as melting ice in the Arctic due to global warming may indeed open up new shipping channels, the Northwest Passage and ports along Greenland's coast. And so the United States, as well as other nations, China and Russia among them, has shown renewed interest in Greenland's resource potential. And as I've discussed in this program, the majority Inuit people in Greenland are intent on preserving their culture and traditions, which they feel would be diluted if they were owned by another country. But on the other hand, they seem very receptive to working with foreign businessmen to improve their standard of living if they do not have to sacrifice political control. These compromises that would be entailed, not to mention Denmark's role in these economic and political relationships, these issues are unfolding before us today. In conclusion, Greenland certainly showed me a remarkable and impressive place, a uniquely beautiful destination of ice and midnight sun, but it's also a vital place to observe and critically to understand firsthand as an emblem of how our planet is changing. And hopefully we will recognize the island's warning signs as a wake-up call for its residents and for the rest of the world before the environmental and cultural damage cannot be reversed. Thank you very much. Has anybody been to Greenland, first of all? Always like to ask that question. You have. Great. Okay. You're unique, one among the group. Are there any comments or questions? Yes, sir.
What kind of fish do they have?
I'm sorry?
What sort of fish?
I think they have some. They have a lot of whitefish. They have They also have salmon there, which I saw. But they also had, and I never really got the name because it was in Greenlandic. They had these very strange-looking spotted fish that were all. I'm not a fisherman, so but nothing that I was familiar with. Oh, virtually nothing I was familiar with. Yes.
You mentioned that they were only 20 miles. What's the relationship between the folks in
Virtually no. So the question is, what's the relationship between their closest land neighbor in Canada? Ellesmere Island is about 20 miles away. I mean, the people who live up there are Inuit themselves, so culturally they do have a connection. I'm not sure to what degree they have gatherings or get-togethers because they do share similar culture, and even their language is similar to Greenlandic. So there may be cultural connections that they have, but nothing on a broad scale.
attempt by Canada to try to influence government?
Nothing that has been publicly announced, no, and I doubt that there is. They respect their sovereignty under Denmark's rule. Yeah.
Are there polar bears up there?
There are, yes, there certainly are. They don't come into town. It's not like some places, but there are towns in Canada that polar bears do come into town. But no, in the north, yes, there are polar bears up in northern Greenland, in very remote areas, which you do have to be careful of if you're out hunting on the ice. Yes.
Right, you tourists going to Nuuk, how long would you go to where you felt that
Well, of course, I wouldn't only go to Nuuk because you really wouldn't get a good sense. I would go up the coast some. I'd take some of the boats up there. But, I think if you went there, that's a question I often get. How long is long enough? And the more you go, the more you get out of any place. And but for a place like Greenland, and sometimes you have to, there's a certain friction of travel. You have to spend a little extra time. There's some lost time. I would say 2.5 to 3 weeks would be a good amount of time if you could do it to stay there. Now, also, it's a little more expensive up there because virtually everything has to be imported. And they do that with large containers that they bring in several times a year. So, for example, there was a Thai restaurant there, of all things, and I asked them, how do they get there? And they pointed to the back of the restaurant, and they had this tremendous container load that comes in by ship a couple of times a year to bring in all the spices and ingredients that they need. But it's expensive. Yes?
You take all of your own photographs?
I do, except for the one I showed of the map. Yeah.
But you get them to pose for it.
Are you speaking about the icebergs or the Inuits? how do I get them to pose for me? The way I take pictures of people anywhere, and that is I establish a connection with them first, unless I'm doing it from a very far, I mean, I do have some long lenses, but typically I do not just go up to people and point a camera at them. I'll try to connect with them in some way, and then at the end of that exchange, ask if I can take a picture. Like at the wedding, for example. I think they were very happy to have their picture taken as a group. Although they also had an official photographer who was taking pictures of them as well. Yeah.
Yes, if a U.S. mining company is interested in a joint venture in mining some of these precious metals,
Mm-hmm.
can they negotiate directly with the U.S. or do they have to go through Denmark?
Yeah, so the question is, if a country is interested in exploiting some of the minerals in Greenland, is it sufficient for them to just work with the Greenland government, or do they have to go through Denmark? Well, since Denmark controls their foreign policy, I would say yes, they need to get a stamp of approval from Denmark as well. Although once they do, I think some of the logistics of actually setting up the enterprise would be governed by Greenland. All right, well, I thank you all very much. Hope this is interesting. I hope you all get to go there.